Dr. Lenora Voss slammed her medical bag onto the administrator's desk hard enough to rattle the inkwell. "I saved that man's life," she said. "3 days ago. In this building. With these hands." Administrator Grayson did not look up from the termination letter he was signing. "The position has been filled," he said. "By whom?" He set down his pen. He looked at her, all of her, with the slow, comprehensive assessment of a man who had already made his decision before she walked through the door. "By someone more suitable," he said. Lenora picked up her bag and walked out. She never went back. If that opening hit you somewhere deep, you stay right here. Subscribe to this channel. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story is traveling, and don't you dare leave before the end. What happens to Dr. Lenora Voss is something you have never heard before. The letter had been sitting in the bottom of Lenora's coat pocket for 11 days. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She had read it on the streetcar home from Grayson's office. She had read it over a supper she didn't touch. She had read it at 3 in the morning with the lamp turned low, sitting on the edge of her bed in the rented room above the cobbler's shop, while Baltimore went on living its ordinary life 4 floors below her window, and she tried to decide whether the most rational thing she had ever done was also the most desperate. She unfolded it one more time. "My name is Calder Rourke. I own a cattle ranch outside Red Willow, Wyoming territory. I am 37 years old in good health and not given to romanticism. I am writing to a matrimonial agency because I require a capable, honest woman who understands that life here is hard and that I will not pretend otherwise. I can offer a clean home, shared responsibility, and a man who keeps his word. I cannot promise you an easy life. I can promise you a real one." She had read a great many letters from the agency file before she selected that one. Most of the men wrote as though they were placing an order for livestock. Good teeth. Able body. No complaints. They listed requirements and offered nothing in return except the opportunity to exist inside their houses. One man had specified that he preferred a woman of moderate dimensions, and had underlined it, which told her everything she needed to know about him and about her prospects in that particular correspondence. Calder Rourke described what he was willing to give. That was the entire difference. She sat at the small desk by the window and wrote back on a Tuesday evening with the lamp burning and the smell of leather rising from the cobbler's shop below. She told him she was 31 years old and unmarried. She told him she had been educated extensively in the medical sciences. She chose her words carefully, the way she chose every word when the stakes mattered: medically educated and experienced in the care of the sick. Not a lie. Precise enough to be true. Incomplete enough to be survivable. She did not use the word physician. She did not tell him she held a medical degree from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania earned after 4 years of study, and 2 more of clinical work that would have broken most people she knew, men included. She did not tell him about the 7 years she had spent trying to build a practice in a city that treated female physicians as either a novelty or an inconvenience, depending on the day and the social position of whoever was forming the opinion. And she did not tell him, could not yet bring herself to tell him, that she weighed approximately 150 kilograms. That she was a large woman, a very large woman, and that her body had been the first thing every room noticed about her for as long as she could reliably remember. She sealed the letter, walked to the post office in the cold, mailed it, and slept better than she had in months. Calder wrote back in 2 weeks. His handwriting was plain and unhurried, each letter pressed firmly into the page. She noticed immediately that he did not begin with pleasantries. "No, I hope this letter finds you well." No performance of manners he hadn't earned yet. He simply began. "Your letter was the most straightforward thing I've received from the agency. I appreciate that you didn't describe yourself as cheerful or eager to please. In my experience, those phrases mean a person has been taught to suppress rather than to feel. Wyoming winters are brutal. A woman who has never left a city ought to think hard before agreeing to come. I have a dog named Henry who does not trust strangers easily. This is his best quality." Lenora laughed out loud, alone in her room with November rain against the glass. She laughed for the first time since she could remember, and then she sat very still for a moment, because the laugh had surprised her, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with the feeling that came after it. She wrote back. He wrote back. For 4 months, they exchanged letters. And in those letters, something happened that Lenora had not predicted. She told him things she had never told anyone. Not about medicine, she kept that wall carefully in place, but about herself. About growing up the daughter of a school teacher who believed his daughter's mind was worth developing even when the world around him disagreed loudly. About the particular quality of silence that falls over a dinner table when a woman mentions she is a physician, and how she had learned to stop mentioning it, because that silence was costing her more than the disclosure was worth. She told him she was difficult to know. He wrote back, "I am not looking for someone easy to know. Easy doesn't last." She carried that line with her for a week before she wrote again, and when she did, she told him she would come. She did not tell him about the black bag. It was old leather, dark brown, gone nearly black with use, with brass clasps worn through to the metal beneath. Her father had given it to her at graduation, had saved for it. Specifically, she learned later, setting aside money from his teaching salary, month by month for 2 years, and he had died before he ever saw her use it, which was a grief she had learned to carry during working hours, without letting it show, and take back out again in private when no one was watching. The bag held a stethoscope, surgical instruments wrapped in oilcloth, forceps, clamps, a surgical needle and catgut thread, morphine sulfate in careful measured vials, carbolic acid, clean cloth for dressings, and a medical reference annotated so heavily in the margins that the original text was sometimes difficult to find. She wrapped the bag in 2 petticoats and buried it at the bottom of her largest trunk beneath her winter dresses and her father's Bible. She told herself she was being practical. A woman traveling alone to unfamiliar territory ought to carry medical supplies. That was sensible. That was not deception. She told herself that for 3 days before she stopped believing it. The truth was simpler and less flattering. She was afraid. She knew exactly what happened when people learned she was a physician. She had watched it occur with a clinical consistency that would have been almost amusing if it hadn't been her life. The expression would shift, always the same sequence, always the same 3 phases. First, surprise, then reassessment, then the particular variety of polite withdrawal that was somehow worse than open hostility, because it dressed itself up as reasonableness. She had seen it in drawing rooms. She had seen it in hospital corridors. She had seen it 9 months ago, most recently, and most devastatingly, across a mahogany desk in an administrator's office at Baltimore City Hospital. She had applied for a staff position, a real position, full privileges, the kind of appointment that would have finally given her the platform her training warranted. The letter offering the interview had addressed her as Dr. Voss. Professional. Respectful. She had dressed carefully that morning and taken the streetcar across the city with her credentials folder on her lap, and she had walked into that office with the specific controlled optimism of a person who has learned not to hope too loudly. The administrator's name was Whitfield. He had looked up from his desk when she entered. She watched it happen in real time, the surprise, the reassessment, and then before she had crossed the room to shake his hand, the decision already made and already final. "Dr. Voss," he said, standing perfectly cordial. "Please sit down." The interview lasted 17 minutes. She counted. "We'll be in touch," Whitfield told her at the end, extending his hand with a smile that did not reach his eyes. 2 weeks later, the position went to a man named Dr. Ellis Pratt, who had graduated 2 years below her from a lesser institution, whose clinical record she happened to know because she had reviewed it once in a professional context and found it unremarkable. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about things like this somewhere around year 4. But she stood outside Whitfield's building in the November cold for a long time, just standing, and something inside her that had been bending for a long time finally made a quiet decision to stop bending and try something else entirely. 3 days later, she slammed the black bag down on Administrator Grayson's desk. And a week after that, she mailed her letter to a cattle rancher in Wyoming. Now packing her trunk in the rented room, she placed the medical bag at the bottom and covered it carefully, and she told herself, "He will meet Lenora first. Just Lenora. Before the physician. Before everything else. Just once I want to walk into a room and have someone know me before they have decided what I am." It was not a lie. It was the most human thing she had ever done. The train west took 11 days. She changed in Chicago, where she sat in the great station hall for 4 hours and watched people move with the purposeful stride of those who know exactly where they are going. A woman at the lunch counter served her a ham sandwich and asked whether she wanted mustard, and did not look at her body or her face in any particular way, just looked at her the way one person looks at another person. And Lenora sat with that small, ordinary thing for a long time after the woman moved on. She changed again in Cheyenne, where the train thinned and the passengers around her shifted into something different. Harder through the jaw, quieter in their movements, wearing clothes chosen for work rather than impression. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass and watched Wyoming arrive. It was enormous in a way that felt almost like an argument. The land did not accommodate the eye the way city landscapes did, offering edges and endings and clear transitions from one thing to the next. Here everything ran together and kept going. For a woman who had spent her life in rooms that felt too small for what she was trying to do, there was something in that limitless expanse that landed differently than she expected. She did not look away. Red Willow Station was small and plain, and exactly what it needed to be, and Lenora stepped off the train onto the platform and saw him before she had fully found her footing. Howe was at the far end of the platform beside the wagon, tall and broad through the shoulders, with the stillness that belongs to men accustomed to waiting on weather. Dark brown hair going silver at the temples. A face that had been shaped by years of outdoor work into something spare and direct. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he was watching the train, and then he was watching her. She had braced for it. She had spent 11 days on the rail bracing for it, rehearsing in her mind a dozen versions of how she would handle the moment with dignity and composure. She had not, it turned out, fully understood what she was bracing for. It was not cruelty. She had faced cruelty enough to know it on sight, and cruelty looked different, louder, less careful, satisfied with itself. This was not that. This was the thing that happened in the half-second before a decent person's manners caught up with their honest first reaction. That fractional pause, that imperceptible adjustment in the line of the jaw and the set of the eyes. And she had become so precise at reading it over the years that she could catch it in people who believed they had hidden it entirely. Calder Rourke was not a man who tried to hide things. The hesitation lasted perhaps 1 second. He saw her see it. He walked toward her without changing pace, stopped 2 feet in front of her, and looked at her directly. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Rourke," she said. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and said nothing except, "We are beginning." He looked past her at the bags and trunks assembling on the platform behind her. "How many of those are yours?" 4. The large one at the end is heaviest. He assessed the trunk, the one with the medical bag wrapped in petticoats at its bottom, and something moved briefly across his face. Not suspicion. Something closer to curiosity. He didn't ask. He took the handle and said, "That one looks like it intends to break my wagon." Something in Lenora's chest loosened by exactly 1 degree. She said, "I packed carefully." "I see that," he said, and there was something at the edge of his voice that was not quite humor, but was not entirely without it, and he lifted the trunk and carried it toward the wagon, and she followed him, and that was how it began. The drive to Rourke Ranch took nearly 2 hours, and the silence between them was the particular kind that exists between 2 people who have said a great deal to each other on paper, and are now discovering that paper and presence are not the same country. After a while she said, "Your dog, Henry, is he territorial?" Calder looked at her sideways. "Where'd you read about Henry?" "Your 3rd letter. You said he didn't trust strangers, and that this was his best quality." A pause. "You remember which letter?" "I have a habit of remembering things." "That useful or a problem?" "Depends on what I'm remembering," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, "Henry takes about a week to decide. If he likes you, he follows you everywhere, and that becomes its own problem. If he doesn't, you'll know in 15 seconds, and you'll need to figure out your next move." "What's the recommended approach?" "Don't perform. He can't stand people who act one way and then change on him. Just be consistent." Lenora looked at the road ahead and said nothing. Just be consistent. She was sitting 3 feet from a man who did not yet know who she was, carrying the evidence of her real self in a trunk behind her, and the dog she hadn't met yet, apparently punished inconsistency. She almost laughed. She kept it to herself. The ranch came into view gradually. Fence line first, then outbuildings, then the main house, timber and stone solid and unhurried with a covered porch running the full length of the front. Not a wealthy house, a serious one, built by someone who intended to stay. Henry appeared from around the side of the building before the wagon had fully stopped. Large dog heavy through the chest, broad-faced with ears that moved independently to track sound. He stopped 10 feet away and assessed her with the frank, unmediated attention of an animal that has no reason to pretend. Lenora did not approach, did not retreat. She simply stood and permitted herself to be examined. Henry walked toward her in stages, stopping twice to reconsider and put his nose against the back of her hand. She let him take his time. He smelled her coat, her skirt, her bag, and then he sat down squarely next to her foot and looked at Calder with the settled expression of someone who has reached a verdict. "Huh," said Calder. "How long?" Lenora asked. 45 seconds. "You said a week." "I said about a week." He was watching Henry with the expression of a man revising a prior certainty. He's never done that with anyone before. "Animals and frightened patients respond to similar things," she said without quite thinking, and then caught herself. "People in difficult situations, I mean. Fear reads the same way in most living creatures. They respond to steadiness." Calder looked at her. She looked at Henry. The moment passed. The first weeks at Rourke Ranch arrived without ceremony and demanded things Lenora had not fully anticipated. The physical scale of daily life was different from anything in Baltimore. The distances between tasks, the sustained outdoor effort, the terrain that had no patience for anyone who needed the ground to cooperate. Her feet ached. Her back ached at the end of every day, in the particular way of someone whose body was working outside its established patterns. She woke stiff and got up anyway, because she had decided before she ever boarded the westbound train that she would not become a burden in this house. She tried the horses once. That was enough. She didn't mention it to Calder. She simply did not appear at the corral in the mornings, and she developed the habit of covering the distances she needed to cover on foot, which was slow and sometimes painful and entirely private. Then one morning, she looked out the kitchen window and saw a wagon beside the barn that had not been there the day before, attached to a draft mare. Large, calm, the kind of animal that appears to have made its peace with the full variety of human difficulty. She went out. Calder was checking the wheel fastenings. "Where did that come from?" "Bought her off a neighbor," he said, not looking up. "She's steady, good on rough ground." "The wagon too." "The wagon too." Lenora looked at the mare. She looked at Calder's hands on the wheel. "Why?" He straightened, looked at her directly the way he looked at everything. "Because covering this territory on foot is impractical, and because I should have thought of it before you arrived. I didn't. That was on me." She stood with that for a moment, not with the words with what they meant. He had watched. He had noticed something she had not named. He had addressed it without requiring her to perform the particular humiliation of announcing a limitation out loud. "Does she have a name?" Lenora asked. "Not yet." "Then I'll name her." "Fine," he said, and went back to the wheel. She named the mare Patience. She found her footing in other ways, the ways her body and mind could reliably deliver. She reorganized the food cellar with the systematic precision she applied to medical cabinets and discovered 3 categories of spoilage. Calder hadn't caught because he hadn't been looking for them. She took over the household accounts and began maintaining them in a proper ledger with projections and notations. She watched and she cataloged and she noticed patterns. The way she had always noticed patterns, which was constantly and somewhat compulsively and occasionally at the cost of social ease. She noticed the ranch hands were getting sick. Not dramatically. 3 men in 2 weeks with the same cluster digestive trouble, persistent fatigue, headache. Minor enough that each man blamed individual bad luck. But Lenora had been watching, and the pattern had a shape, and the shape pointed toward the well and its position relative to the waste trench on the east side of the yard. She told Calder over supper. He listened without interrupting, which she was coming to understand was his habit. When she finished, he set down his fork. "You're saying the well is making them sick?" I'm saying the proximity and the symptom pattern are consistent with contamination. Moving the trench is the reasonable precaution. That's 3 days of work. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. You sound very certain for someone who said it's a precaution. I'm not certain, she said. I'm reading available evidence and giving you my best assessment. What you do with it is your decision. He moved the trench the following week. The men stopped getting sick. Neither of them mentioned it directly. But 2 days after the last man recovered, Calder came in from the yard at midday. Not his habit, he rarely came in before supper, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stood at the kitchen window with his back to her for a moment. Then he said without turning, "Where'd you learn to read patterns like that?" Lenora kept her eyes on the ledger. From someone who believed it was worth learning. Your father. Yes. He nodded once and drank his coffee and went back outside, and she sat with the ledger open in front of her, and understood that something had shifted between them quietly, without announcement, in the way that real things tend to shift. He was adding things up. She could feel him adding things up, and the sum was getting close to a number she hadn't shown him yet. 3 days later, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Decker, 20 at most, still growing into the width of his own shoulders, made a remark in the yard within Lenora's hearing. She was crossing from the house to the barn. She heard it clearly. It was not sophisticated in its cruelty. It was the ordinary variety, the kind that does not require much imagination to produce referencing her size in terms meant to be heard. She kept walking. She did not stop. She did not change her pace. She went into the barn, found what she had come for, and came back out. And by the time she crossed the yard again, Decker was conspicuously absent, and Calder was standing near the fence post where Decker had been standing, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has recently concluded a conversation. At supper that evening, Calder said, "Decker wanted me to tell you he's sorry for something he said earlier. He was unclear on what's acceptable on this property. He's clear on it now." Lenora looked at her plate. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that my wife is a guest in this house until she decides it's her house, and that anyone who makes her feel otherwise can collect their pay and find somewhere else to be unclear." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't ask me whether I wanted you to handle it." "No," he said. "I didn't." She thought about that. "I'm capable of handling it myself." "I know that," he said. "That's not why I did it." "Then why?" He looked at her across the table with that straight, unmediated gaze. "Because it happened on my property. Because it was wrong. And because a man ought to make clear what he will and will not tolerate under his own roof." He paused. "Those are my reasons. They don't have anything to do with your capability." Lenora held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and picked up his fork. It was the most she could manage. It was also, she realized, the first time anyone had stepped forward without asking her permission or expecting her gratitude, simply because it was the correct thing to do. She thought about that for several days. She was still thinking about it when Merritt Shaw arrived. He came on a Thursday afternoon riding hard, holding his left arm against his body, with the careful, deliberate grip of a man managing something serious. She heard the hooves from the kitchen and came to the porch and saw him pulling up in the yard with his face set hard against the pane. "Calder here," he called. "Inside," she said. She was already down the steps. "What happened?" "Fencing wire," he said through teeth pressed together. "Came free when I was pulling it tight. Took a piece of my arm." She reached him, and he extended the arm, and she looked at it. One single comprehensive look, the kind that 7 years of training had compressed into a reflex, and everything else stopped. The wound was deep, very deep. The blood loss was already significant. The contamination from rusted field wire, a serious secondary concern, and the involvement of the underlying structures was something she needed to assess immediately. "Get inside," she said. "Now." Calder appeared at the sound of her voice, not her ordinary voice he would understand later, but the other one, the one that hadn't been used in 7 weeks, and he took one look at Merritt and came down the steps fast. "What?" "Kitchen table," Lenora said. "Clean cloth. Every clean cloth in the house. Hot water. Now Calder." He looked at her. For 1/2 second he looked at her in a way she couldn't fully read. Then he moved. They got Merritt onto the kitchen table with Calder's bandana pressed against the wound, and the blood was coming through the folded cloth with a persistence that made Calder's jaw tighten. And Lenora looked at what they had and what they needed, and made the calculation she had made 100 times in clinical settings when the resources didn't match the requirements. She ran upstairs. She was back in 40 seconds. She set the black medical bag on the kitchen table. She opened the brass clasps. The instruments were wrapped in oilcloth. The carbolic acid solution was in its bottle. Everything in its place, the way it had always been in its place, because she had been a physician for 7 years, and a physician's tools were not things you kept in disorder. She pulled out the carbolic first, then the instruments, then the thread. Her hands knew where they were going. The part of her mind that had been managing a deception for 7 weeks went completely quiet. There was no room for it. There was only the wound and the patient and the next correct thing to do in order without hesitation. "Hold his arm steady," she said to Calder. He did it without a word. "Merritt," she said, and waited until the man's eyes found hers. "This is going to hurt considerably. I can give you something for the pain. It'll dull your thinking for a few hours. Do you want it?" Merritt looked at this bag, at the instruments, at her hands. "Who in the—" he started. "The person cleaning your wound," she said. "Do you want the morphine or not? A beat. What's morphine? It takes the worst edge off the pain. You'll still feel it, but you won't care as much." "Give it," he said. She gave it. She worked. Calder held Merritt's arm and did not speak, which was exactly what she needed. Steady hands, steady presence, no questions, no second-guessing. She irrigated the wound thoroughly. She debrided the contaminated tissue with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was removing and why. She closed the laceration in layers deep structures first, then surfaced 12 sutures even, and cleaned the kind of closure that would hold and heal with minimal scarring. She dressed it. She bound it. She stepped back. "Keep it elevated tonight," she told Merritt. "No use of that arm. Change the dressing tomorrow morning with clean cloth. If you see a line, not general redness, a specific line tracking up the arm, you come back to me immediately. Do you understand?" Merritt looked at his arm. He looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something entirely different in the way he said it than the way men in this territory usually said ma'am to her. She began cleaning the instruments. The kitchen was very quiet. She could feel Calder behind her. She took her time because the instruments needed to be cleaned properly, and also because she needed the activity, the methodical, familiar work of restoring order to the tools of her profession to find her way back to the surface. She dried the last instrument, wrapped it, set it back in the bag. She closed the clasps. She turned around. Calder was standing at the far side of the kitchen table, arms crossed over his chest, watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not anger. Not quite. Something more complicated than anger, something that had several things moving in it at once, and she recognized the look of a man whose internal accounting has just been entirely revised. Merritt had pushed himself up to sitting and was staring at his own arm with the expression of a man who had arrived expecting serious damage and received instead a small, careful miracle. The silence held for 5 full seconds. Then Calder said quietly, "Lenora." She looked at him. "What exactly were you," he said, "before you came here?" Her hands were resting on top of the medical bag. She felt the brass clasps beneath her palms warm from being closed, familiar from years of use from emergency rooms and farmhouse kitchens and back rooms where people came when they had nowhere else to go, and she was the only one who could help. She had carried this bag across an entire continent. She had buried it under petticoats and pretended it didn't exist. She had spent 7 weeks being Lenora the rancher's wife, Lenora the practical woman, Lenora who noticed things and kept accounts and named her mare. Patience, and hadn't once, not once, been Lenora the doctor. She looked at Calder Rourke across the kitchen table. "Exactly what I still am," she said. She lifted her chin. "A doctor." Calder did not say another word that night. That was the thing Lenora had not prepared for. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for questions, accusations, the particular cold variety of male displeasure that she had encountered enough times to have developed a posture for it, spine straight, voice level, eyes forward. She had even prepared in the darkest corner of her rehearsals on the train for the possibility that he would ask her to leave. She had not prepared for silence. He helped Merritt out to his horse. He came back inside. He looked at the black medical bag still sitting on the kitchen table, and then he looked at her, and then he picked up his hat from the hook by the door and walked out to the porch, and she heard the creak of the porch boards as he settled into the chair out there, and then nothing. She cleaned the kitchen. She washed the table where Merritt had been lying. She put away the remaining supplies. She wrapped the instruments back in their oilcloth with the careful, methodical attention she gave to the task every time, because her father had told her once that the way a physician treats her tools between patients tells you everything about how she treats her patients, and she had never forgotten it. She carried the bag upstairs and set it on the chair in her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She listened to the silence from the porch below and understood that she was going to have to go back down there eventually, and that eventually was probably now. She found him in the porch chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and his gaze on the dark yard, and Henry was lying at his feet the way Henry lay at her feet now, which had become its own quiet fact of life at Rourke Ranch over the past 7 weeks. She sat in the other chair. The night was clear and cold, and the stars over Wyoming were the kind of extravagant that still caught her off guard sometimes, coming from a city where the sky was always half-eaten by lamplight. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Calder said, "How long have you been a doctor?" Not a question. A request for information delivered in the tone of a man who is being very careful about his tone. 7 years since I completed my degree, she said. Longer if you count the training. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. And you didn't tell me? No. In 4 months of letters? No. You told me a great deal about yourself in those letters, he said. You told me about your father. You told me about Baltimore. You told me you were medically educated. He paused. That last part was true. It was. It was also not the whole truth. No, she said. It wasn't. Another silence. Longer this time. I want to understand something, Calder said. You crossed a continent. You married a stranger. You've been living in this house for 7 weeks doing accounts and reorganizing the cellar and naming the horse. He stopped. And the whole time that bag was upstairs. Yes. Why? She had answered this question in her head so many times in so many versions that she thought she had found the right words for it long before this moment. She discovered now that the right words and the true words were not always the same thing. Because every time someone learned I was a physician, she said, that became the only thing they saw, before they saw me work, before they knew whether I was competent or kind or worth trusting. The moment they heard the word doctor attached to my name, the decision was already made. She looked at her hands in her lap. And the moment they saw my body, another decision was already made. I have been walking into rooms my entire adult life and watching people form 2 opinions about me before I have said a single word. She paused. I wanted just once to walk into a room and be known before I was categorized. I thought if you knew me first, just me, then when you found out the rest, you would already have something to measure it against. Calder was quiet for a long moment. That's not an unreasonable thing to want, he said finally. She looked at him. It's also not what you said in your letters, he said. In your letters you told me you valued honesty. You told me a man who keeps his word is worth trusting. You wrote those words, Lenora. I kept your letters. That landed exactly where it was meant to land. I know, she said. I'm not angry that you're a physician, he said. I want to make that clear. What you did tonight, what I watched you do at that table, I don't have a word for what that was. I have never seen anything like it. His jaw tightened slightly. But I am angry that you didn't trust me enough to tell me. I wrote you about my finances and my debts and the bad winter 2 years ago that nearly took the herd. I told you things I haven't told another person. And you sat across from me at that table every night for 7 weeks and didn't tell me who you were." "You're right," she said. "I know I'm right," he said. "I'm asking you to understand why it matters. Because you thought we were being honest with each other." "Because we were being honest with each other," he said. "Or I was. And I thought you were. And now I'm sitting here trying to figure out what else I might not know." She had no answer for that. Because he was right, and she knew he was right, and the particular quality of his anger, quiet fare grounded in something real, was harder to sit with than any version of rage would have been. She said, "I don't know how to make that right, except to tell you now and let you decide what to do with it." "So tell me." She told him. She told him about the woman's medical college, about the years of training, about the slow accumulation of small professional humiliations that had preceded the larger ones. She told him about Whitfield and the 17-minute interview, though she kept her voice level when she did, because she had promised herself years ago that she would not perform that particular grief for audiences. She told him about the hospital positions that went to men with lesser records, about the private patients who occasionally trusted her and then stopped when their social circles expressed disapproval about the evening. She had stood outside a building in November cold and made the calculation that her professional life, as she had been trying to live it, was not going to work. She told him about her father. She told him about the bag. When she finished, the night had gotten later and the cold had come up properly, and Henry had moved from Calder's feet to press against her leg with the solid, uncomplicated warmth of an animal that has made its assessment and is comfortable with the conclusion. Calder was looking at her. "The well," he said. "What?" 3 weeks ago. The contamination. That wasn't something an educated woman reads in a household manual." "No," she said. "And the way you watched the men. The way you watched everyone." He shook his head once. "I thought you were simply observant." "I am observant. I'm also a diagnostician." "Henry knew," Calder said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor and not quite grief, and lived somewhere in the complicated space between the two. "Henry doesn't care what I do for a living," Lenora said. "He cares what kind of person I am." Calder looked at the dog. He looked at her. "Maybe he's smarter than I am." She didn't answer that. He stood up. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the porch rail. He looked at her for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding something, and she made herself hold still and let him decide it without trying to influence the outcome. "I need to think," he said. "All right." "I'm not asking you to leave," he said. "I want to be clear about that." She nodded. "But I'm not ready to be finished being angry yet." "That's fair," she said. He went inside. She sat on the porch with Henry until the cold got serious, and then she went upstairs to her room and lay on the bed with her eyes open and listened to the house settle around her, and she thought I told the truth eventually. But eventually is a long way from the beginning, and some people can't forgive the distance. She did not sleep well. She did not sleep well for several nights, but life at Rourke Ranch did not pause for the difficulty between them, because ranch life did not pause for anything. Not for human complications, not for unresolved arguments, not for the specific emotional weather of two people trying to find the new shape of an arrangement that had been built on incomplete information. The cattle needed tending. The accounts needed maintaining. Meals needed cooking. Lenora did her portion of all of it with the same steady competence she had been applying since she arrived, and Calder did his, and they passed each other in the kitchen and the yard, with the careful courtesy of two people who have agreed without stating it aloud that the work comes first. It was 3 days before he spoke to her about anything beyond the practical. She was at the desk with the ledger when he came in from the yard and poured a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and said without preamble, "Merritt's arm is healing." "Good," she said without looking up. "He told me you gave him something for the pain. Morphine sulfate measured dose, appropriate for the injury. He said he didn't feel the sutures going in. That's the general idea." A pause. "He also said you talked him through what you were doing while you did it. Told him what each step was before you took it." Lenora set down her pen. "Some patients tolerate procedure better when they know what's coming. Merritt struck me as that kind of man." Calder was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "My wife was sick," he said. 3 years ago, before she died." Lenora went very still. She was sick for a long time before anyone knew what it was, he said. The doctor in Red Willow Crew, he came out 3 times. He told her she was tired. He told her she needed rest. He told her it was a woman's constitution and that she needed to be patient. He set down the cup. She died of what turned out to be a perforated appendix. Crew diagnosed it 4 hours before the end and called it bad luck. Lenora said nothing. She would have been 34 this year, Calder said. The kitchen was very quiet. Calder, she said. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me, he said. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I know what it means when a physician pays attention and what it means when one doesn't. And what I watched you do at that table with Merritt, that was someone who was paying attention. He picked up his cup again. I'm still angry about the letters. I want to be clear that I'm still angry. But I'm not confused about what I saw. Those are 2 separate things, she said. Yes, he said. They are. She looked at him across the kitchen and understood that this was Calder Rourke's version of a significant concession. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the acknowledgement that anger and respect could occupy the same space without one canceling the other. For a man whose natural mode was compressed and spare, it was considerable. I'm sorry, she said. For the letters, for the omission. I should have trusted you. Yes, he said. You should have. I was afraid. I know, he said. That doesn't fix it, but I know. He finished his coffee and went back outside. She sat at the desk with the ledger closed in front of her and thought that the most honest conversation she had ever had with a man had just taken place over 2 minutes and a cup of coffee in a Wyoming kitchen, and she did not know whether to be grateful for it or devastated by how long it had taken her to earn it. What happened next, she did not anticipate. She had expected the revelation of her profession to be contained a private rupture between herself and Calder, something they would work through or not work through in the particular privacy of their imperfect arrangement. She had not considered that the information would spread beyond the walls of Rourke Ranch, carried on the ordinary current of frontier gossip, and the specific efficient communication network of neighboring ranches that she was still learning to account for. Merritt Shaw talked, not maliciously, not carelessly. He talked the way a man talks when something remarkable has happened to him, and he needs to process it through language, which for most men meant telling other men. He told the story of the fencing wire and the kitchen table and the black medical bag, and the woman who had closed his arm with 12 sutures and explained every step while she did it. And the story moved from Merritt to his ranch hands, and from his ranch hands to the men they drank with on Saturday evenings, and from those men to their wives and employers and neighbors, and inside 2 weeks it had covered the valley with the speed and comprehensiveness of a grass fire. The first additional patient arrived on a Wednesday morning. He was a ranch hand from a spread 3 miles east, a lean, weathered man in his 40s named Coulter, who had a hand that had been broken and healed badly 6 months prior, and was causing him pain that made sleep difficult and work harder than it needed to be. He rode up to Rourke Ranch and knocked on the door and took off his hat when Lenora answered and said, "Ma'am, I heard there's a doctor here." Lenora looked at him. "Come in," she said. She examined the hand at the kitchen table. Calder's kitchen table, which was rapidly developing a secondary identity as an examination surface, and assessed the malunion of the fracture and what could and could not be done about it at this stage. She gave him exercises. She gave him specific instructions about how to wrap the hand to support the affected joint during work. She told him plainly what she could offer and what was beyond the scope of what she could provide. Without surgical intervention, she was not currently equipped to perform. He listened carefully. He thanked her with the particular sincerity of a man who has been dealing with pain long enough that being taken seriously about it registers as something close to mercy. He left. 2 days later, a woman arrived with a child running a fever that had lasted 3 days. The day after that, a homesteader from 7 miles out with a wound on his leg that had begun showing the preliminary signs of infection. Lenora treated them all at the kitchen table. Calder said nothing about it directly, but she noticed things the way he began timing his indoor work to be present when strangers arrived, not intrusively, just present. The way he made sure the water in the kitchen was always hot in the mornings. Small adjustments, unhurried, made without comment in the way he made most decisions. Then the phrase reached her. She heard it first from Calder, who came back 2 weeks after his initial visit to report that the exercises were helping and mentioned in passing that he had told a friend about her. "Told him to come see the big lady doctor out at Rourke Ranch," he said without any apparent awareness that the phrase required any particular handling. Lenora kept her face composed. "Did he come?" "Said he would." She thanked Calder and showed him out and stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. The big lady doctor. She turned the phrase over. She examined it the way she examined everything methodically, looking for what it actually contained rather than what it felt like. It was not intended as cruelty. That was clear enough. It was simply the most efficient description available to a man who needed to direct another man to a specific person in a specific location and had chosen the two most immediately identifiable facts about her. It still sat in her chest at a painful angle. She was standing there when Calder came in from the barn. He looked at her expression. "What happened?" "Nothing," she said. He looked at her with the unhurried directness that had become familiar. "Lenora." She told him what Calder had said. Something moved through Calder's face, a quick tightening that passed before it became fully readable. He set down what he was carrying. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was being careful about what he said next. "People are coming to this door needing help," she said before he could speak. "Whatever they called me on the road to get here is not the part that matters." Calder looked at her. "It matters to me." "It matters to me too," she said. "But not as much as whether they leave better than they arrived." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him make some internal decision she couldn't fully read. "All right," he said. He went back outside. She went back to the ledger. What happened next happened quietly over 3 days while Lenora was treating patients at the kitchen table and managing the household accounts and trying not to think too carefully about whether this arrangement was sustainable or whether she was building something on borrowed time. She noticed on the first day that Calder had cleared the old storage room beside the kitchen. It had been used for miscellaneous tools and equipment and the general accumulation of a working ranch, and it was empty now, swept clean, and she assumed he was reorganizing the storage somewhere else and thought nothing of it. On the second day, there were fresh-cut boards stacked outside the storage room door. On the third day, she heard hammering. She came to the doorway of the storage room and stood there and watched Calder Rourke, who had spent a minimum of 12 hours a day running a cattle ranch for the past several weeks, while also silently managing his anger at her and arriving at some private resolution. She had not been party to building shelves along the interior wall with the focused economical competence of a man who does what needs doing without requiring an audience for it. He heard her and looked up. I didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the space. She looked at the examination table he had clearly framed in, and was partway through completing, built low and wide and sturdy enough to hold any patient she would ever put on it. "Calder," she said. "If people are coming here for a doctor," he said, and went back to his work, "they ought to find a doctor's office when they arrive." She stood in the doorway. She pressed her hand against the doorframe. She had been called a physician and treated like a curiosity. She had been granted privileges and had them quietly revoked. She had been tolerated and humored and occasionally genuinely respected, and she knew the difference between all of those things with the precision of someone who had spent years cataloging the distinctions. This was none of those things. This was a man who had been angry at her justifiably, and he had told her so plainly, and who had gone away, and thought about it, and come back and built her a room. "Why?" she said. Not because she didn't understand, because she needed to hear him say it. He set down the hammer. He turned and looked at her with that straight, uncomplicated gaze. "Because you're good at what you do, because people need it, and because you came a long way to have somewhere to do it, and you shouldn't have to do it on my kitchen table." He picked up the hammer again. "Also," he said, "I'd like to eat supper in that kitchen without wondering where the last patient was lying." She almost laughed. She pressed her hand harder against the doorframe and held the almost laugh in because if she let it out, it was going to become something else, and she was not yet ready for that. "I'll get the shelves organized," she said. "I figured," he said. She retrieved the black medical bag from her room and brought it downstairs and set it on the partially built examination table and began mentally cataloging what a proper physician's office required and what she currently had and what the gap between those two lists looked like. The gap was significant. She was working through it when Calder appeared in the doorway, and she told him systematically what was needed: specific instruments, supplies, reference materials, containers for organization. And he listened and nodded and said nothing until she finished, and then he said, "Make me a list. I'll go into Red Willow on Friday." "That's going to cost money," she said. "I know what it costs." "Calder, Lenora." He said her name in the particular way that meant, "I have made a decision, and I am not revisiting it." "Make me the list." She made him the list. She was precise about it. A physician's list organized by priority and function, with notations about acceptable substitutions and quantities required for a reasonable starting inventory. She handed it to him Thursday evening, and he folded it into his shirt pocket, and that was that. He came back from Red Willow on Friday afternoon with the wagon loaded, and Henry trotting alongside looking pleased with himself for reasons known only to the dog. Lenora carried the supplies in and organized them with the focused attention she gave to anything that involved the proper management of a medical practice. Calder helped without being asked, handing things through the door, moving the heavier items to where she indicated, asking the specific practical questions of a man who wants to understand a system well enough to support it. At one point, he picked up a bottle of carbolic acid solution and turned it over, reading the label. "This is what you used on Merritt." "Yes." "Why?" "Contamination control. Joseph Lister published his work on antiseptic technique about 15 years ago. The evidence strongly supports it. Most frontier medicine hasn't caught up, which is one of the reasons infection kills more people out here than the initial injuries do." Calder looked at the bottle for a moment. "Crew doesn't use this," he said. "I don't know Dr. Crew's methods," she said carefully. He set the bottle down on the shelf where she'd indicated. "I do," he said, and the two words carried enough weight that she did not ask him to elaborate. She did not need to. She understood with the clarity of a diagnostician connecting available data points that Dr. Silas Crew of Red Willow, Wyoming territory was going to become relevant to her situation in the near future, and that when he did, the relevance was not going to be comfortable. She was right. The first word of it reached her through Ada Bell. Ada ran the boarding house in Red Willow, a compact, sharp-eyed widow of 39, with the particular brand of social intelligence that develops in people who are professionally required to manage the comfort and conflict of strangers in close proximity. Calder had mentioned her in passing as the person most reliably informed about what was actually happening in Red Willow, as opposed to what people officially claimed was happening, which Lenora had filed away as useful. Ada arrived at Rourke Ranch on a Tuesday morning in a one-horse buggy, came to the door with a jar of preserved peaches, and the expression of a woman conducting reconnaissance. She would not describe as reconnaissance, and introduced herself with the directness of someone who had decided she liked Lenora before she arrived, and was now simply confirming the assessment. "You're the doctor," Ada said, looking at her. "I'm Calder's wife," Lenora said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Ada said, and walked in. She stayed for 2 hours. She drank 3 cups of coffee. She examined the new clinic room with the frank appraising eye of a woman evaluating whether an investment is worth making. And when she came back to the kitchen, she sat down at the table and looked at Lenora and said, "Crew knows about you." Lenora kept her hands folded on the table. "I expected that. He's been telling people you're not a real physician, that your degree isn't legitimate, that you married Calder because you failed back east and needed someone to support you." The kitchen was very quiet. "He's also been telling people," Ada said more carefully, "that a woman of your size doesn't have the physical endurance required for frontier medicine." Lenora sat with that for a moment. "That's 3 separate arguments," she said. "He's covering his options." Ada looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. "Most women would be crying right now." "I might cry later," Lenora said. "Right now I'm categorizing." Ada put down her coffee cup. "What are you going to do about it?" Keep working, Lenora said. That's it. That's everything, Lenora said. The only argument that holds against what he's saying is a body of work he can't dispute. So I build one. Ada looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and set a folded piece of paper on the table. There are families in the valley who haven't had access to a physician in years, she said. Crew doesn't go beyond a certain radius and everyone knows it. These are people who need help and haven't been able to get it. If you're building a body of work, these are the people to start with. Lenora unfolded the paper. It was a list of names and locations written in Ada's clean, efficient hand. She looked at it. She looked at Ada. Why are you doing this? She said. Ada picked up her coffee cup. Because I had a husband who needed a doctor and got Crew instead, and I know exactly what that costs. She paused. And because I think you're the most interesting thing that has happened to this valley in a long time, and I intend to be on the right side of it. Lenora folded the paper carefully and set it in her pocket. I'll need help organizing the supply runs, she said. I can't carry everything in the wagon myself for the more distant calls. I know people, Ada said. I expect you do. I'll be back Thursday, Ada said, standing. She picked up her jar of preserved peaches and set it on the kitchen counter. Those are for Calder. He looks like he doesn't eat enough fruit. She walked out. Lenora sat at the kitchen table with Ada's list in her pocket and the organized supply shelves visible through the clinic doorway and the black medical bag on the examination table where Calder had built it to stand, and she thought about Crew and his three-pronged argument and what it meant to have an enemy you had never met who was already working to dismantle you. She thought about the administrator in Baltimore who had not looked up from his desk. She thought about Whitfield and his 17-minute interview and Dr. Ellis Pratt with his unremarkable clinical record. She thought about every door that had been closed before she reached it, and every room that had reconfigured itself to make her smaller when she entered, and every version of herself she had been asked to perform that was less than what she actually was. She pressed her hand flat on the table. Then she went into the clinic room, picked up the medical bag, and began reorganizing the supply shelves in the specific order she needed for efficient clinical work, because Ada Bell was coming back on Thursday, and there was a list of families in the valley who needed a physician, and Lenora Voss had not crossed a continent and built a room and survived 7 weeks of her own deception to stop here. Calder came in from the yard as the light was failing and found her still at it, and he stood in the clinic doorway and looked at what she'd done. Ada came today, she said without turning around. I figured, saw her buggy. Crew is telling people I'm not a real physician. A pause. What are you going to do? She turned around. She looked at him across the clinic room that he had built with his own hands in 3 days while he was still angry at her. Keep going, she said. Calder looked at her for a moment. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the bag. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has revised his accounting several times in recent weeks and may be arriving at a figure he had not originally anticipated. He nodded once. All right then, he said. He went to make supper. She turned back to the shelves. Outside, somewhere in the valley, Dr. Silas Crew was telling people that the woman at Rourke Ranch was not what she claimed to be. He had no idea what she was about to become. The first time Lenora lost a patient in Red Willow Valley, it wasn't because of anything she did wrong. That was the part that stayed with her longest. A homesteader named Garrett Finch, 41 years old, had been sick for 3 weeks before his wife finally brought him to Rourke Ranch in the back of their wagon. 3 weeks during which he had apparently visited Dr. Silas Crew twice in Red Willow and been told both times that his symptoms were consistent with fatigue and that rest and iron tonic would restore him. 3 weeks during which the actual problem, a slow internal bleeding, Lenora identified within 15 minutes of examination, had been advancing without intervention. She told Mrs. Finch the truth immediately, because she had decided years ago that patients and their families deserved the truth told plainly, and that softening it into something more comfortable was a kindness that belonged to the physician rather than the patient. His condition is serious, she said. The bleeding needs surgical intervention. I'm not equipped to perform here. He needs to get to Cheyenne, today. Mrs. Finch looked at her husband on the examination table. She looked at Lenora. She was a small woman, dry-faced from years of wind and work, and she did not cry. "How long does he have?" "If you leave within the hour, there's a reasonable chance," Lenora said. "I won't promise more than that because I don't know more than that." "Crew told us it was fatigue." "I know." "He told us twice." "I know," Lenora said. "I'm telling you something different. The decision is yours." Mrs. Finch looked at her husband for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Help me get him back in the wagon." They left within the hour. Lenora gave Mrs. Finch written notes on Garrett's condition and what to tell the surgeon in Cheyenne. Precise, organized notes, the kind she would have written for a hospital transfer, because whoever received Garrett Finch deserved to know exactly what they were working with. She stood in the yard and watched the wagon go, and then went inside and sat in the clinic room and did not move for a while. Calder came in and found her there. He didn't ask what was wrong. He looked at her face, and he understood the shape of it, and he went to the kitchen and came back with coffee and set it on the examination table beside her, and sat down in the chair against the wall and said nothing. That was the right thing to do. She did not know yet how to tell him that it was the right thing to do. So she simply picked up the coffee and held it, and was grateful in the private, unperformed way of someone who has not had enough practice receiving uncomplicated kindness. Garrett Finch died in Cheyenne 4 days later. The surgeon's note reached Rourke Ranch through Ada Bell, who brought it in person and sat with Lenora in the kitchen while she read it. The note confirmed what Lenora had identified. It confirmed that intervention had been attempted. It confirmed that the delay of 3 weeks had made the difference between possible and impossible. Ada watched her put the note down. "This isn't your fault," Ada said. "I know," Lenora said. "Do you?" Lenora looked at the note. "I know it the way I know anatomy. Intellectually. Completely." She paused. "That's not the same as it not hurting." Ada put her hand over Lenora's on the table. They sat like that for a moment. Then Lenora said, "Crew is going to use this." Ada was quiet. "He's going to say I gave the family false hope, that I sent them on an unnecessary journey, that my diagnosis was wrong, and the trip itself contributed to his decline." She said it without inflection, the way she recited clinical findings clearly and without drama, because clarity was the only useful tool she had. "He's going to use a dead man to make his argument." Ada's jaw tightened. "Can he?" "He can try," Lenora said. "The surgeon's note supports my diagnosis, but Crew doesn't need to be right. He only needs people to be uncertain." She was right. Within a week, a version of the story was moving through Red Willow that bore only a partial resemblance to what had actually occurred. In this version, Lenora had alarmed the Finch family, unnecessarily sent a sick man on a brutal journey. He couldn't survive, and the whole tragedy might have been avoided if they had simply trusted Dr. Crew's assessment and allowed the man to rest. Lenora heard it from 3 different sources in 5 days. Ada told her. A ranch hand who'd been in town told Calder, who told Lenora that evening at supper, with the flat, careful tone of a man delivering information he does not enjoy delivering. And a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who had brought her daughter to the clinic 2 weeks earlier, and whose daughter had recovered cleanly from a respiratory infection, came to Rourke Ranch specifically to warn Lenora that people were talking. "I don't believe a word of it," Mrs. Hartley said, sitting at the kitchen table. "But I thought you should know what's being said." "I appreciate that," Lenora said. "Crew has a lot of friends in this town," Mrs. Hartley said. "He's been here 20 years. He delivered half the children in the valley." "I understand." "Some people are going to believe him no matter what you do." "I know." Mrs. Hartley looked at her steadily. "You don't seem frightened." Lenora thought about that. "I seem calm," she said. "That's not always the same thing." She was frightened. She would not have admitted it to most people, but she was frightened in the specific way of someone who can see the shape of what is coming and understands that preparation only takes you so far. She had built something here, genuinely built it with her hands and her training, and Calder's lumber, and Ada's list, and the trust of people who had let her into their homes and their pain. She had built it from nothing, and she was watching someone work methodically to dismantle it from the outside. And the worst part was that she could not fully defend herself against it, because the weapon crew same week crew's second attack arrived. It came in the form of a letter not to Lenora directly, but to the Territorial Medical Board, a copy of which found its way to Ada Bell through channels that Ada refused to specify. The letter questioned the legitimacy of Lenora's credentials, suggested that a degree from an institution that admitted women was of questionable standing, and requested that the board investigate whether Dr. Lenora Voss Rourke was practicing medicine legally within the territory. Ada set the copy on Lenora's kitchen table without comment. Lenora read it twice. She set it down. "He's done his research," she said. "He's had help," Ada said. "Someone contacted Baltimore on his behalf, one of the hospital administrators." Lenora went very still. "Which one?" Ada looked at her. "Grayson." The name hit her like a flat stone. Grayson. The man who had signed the termination letter without looking up. The man whose inkwell she had rattled with the black bag on the worst morning of her professional life. Grayson, who apparently had enough professional investment in her failure to correspond with a territorial physician in Wyoming about her credentials. She had crossed a continent. It had not been far enough. "My credentials are legitimate," she said. "I know that," Ada said. "You know that. The board will find it when they investigate." She paused. "But the investigation takes time. And while it's happening, crew will be using it as evidence that there's something worth investigating." Lenora stood up. She paced the length of the kitchen, something she rarely did. She was not a pacer. She was a sitter, a thinker, a person who processed in stillness. But she paced now because the alternative was doing something less useful. "He's attacking my degree," she said. "He's attacking my diagnosis of Finch. He's attacking my physical ability to practice frontier medicine." She stopped. "And he's going to get to the fourth one eventually." "The fourth one?" "Why I hid my profession from Calder when we married." She turned. "Why would a legitimate physician conceal her credentials from her own husband? That's his strongest argument, and he hasn't used it yet, which means he's saving it." Ada looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" Lenora sat back down. She looked at her hands on the table. Large hands, strong hands. A physician's hands that had sutured Merritt Shaw's arm and examined Garrett Finch and treated 37 patients in the clinic room that Calder had built with his own hands because he believed she deserved a door. "I want to keep working," she said. "Crew is going to make that very difficult." "He already is," Lenora said. "That doesn't change the answer." But the answer became harder to hold on to over the following 2 weeks. 3 families who had been considering bringing sick relatives to the clinic did not come. A ranch hand who had been scheduled to return for a follow-up examination sent word that he would be seeing crew in town instead. 2 women who had spoken warmly to Lenora at Ada's boarding house stopped meeting her eyes when she passed them on the road into Red Willow. She felt it. She felt each one the way you feel individual drops of rain before a storm separately at first, then all at once, until the accumulation was undeniable. She did not tell Calder how much it was costing her. She told herself this was because he had his own concerns, and she did not intend to become one of them. The more honest version, which she examined at night in the small room with the window facing west, was that she did not yet know how to be fully known by another person in the specific way that included being seen at her lowest. She had spent so long managing her own vulnerability in private that she had lost the habit of sharing it. Calder figured it out anyway. I was not a man who missed things, she had learned. He was quiet about what he noticed, but he noticed everything. And one evening after supper, when she was sitting at the clinic desk with a lamp burning and a medical reference open that she wasn't actually reading, he appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame and looked at her for a moment. "You're not reading that book," he said. "No," she said. "How bad is it?" She set the book down. She looked at him. She decided for the first time to answer the question honestly instead of manageably. "Bad enough," she said. "I'm losing patience to rumors I can't directly refute. I'm under investigation by the Territorial Board for credentials that are entirely legitimate. And Crew hasn't used his most effective argument yet, which means he's strategic about it, and I need to be more strategic than he is." She paused. "And I'm frightened that I've built something here that is going to be taken apart piece by piece before it ever becomes what it could be." Calder was quiet for a moment. Do you want to know what I see? He said. Yes. He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room and sat down in the chair across from her. The chair she used for patients, solid and straight-backed. The chair that Calder had built along with everything else, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. I see a woman who came here with everything hidden and has spent 3 months building something real, he said. I see a clinic room full of supplies and a list of patients who got better because of what you did. I see Merritt Shaw's arm, which healed clean. I see a ranch hand who can sleep again because of how you wrapped his hand. I see Mrs. Hartley's daughter who had a fever that broke. He paused. I see a man named Garrett Finch who deserved a real diagnosis 3 weeks sooner than he got one, and who got it from you when it finally came, even when it was too late to save him. That's not a failure on your part. That's a failure on the part of the man who had 3 weeks and didn't use them. Lenora did not say anything. Crew has been here 20 years, Calder said. But 20 years of being the only option is not the same as 20 years of being the best option. And people in this valley have had enough time with the only option to know the difference. She looked at him across the examination table. Something in her chest did the thing it occasionally did when Calder said something that landed precisely in the space where she most needed something to land. A loosening, a small involuntary release of a tension she hadn't known she was still holding. You believe I can outlast him, she said. I believe you already are, he said. You just can't see it yet from where you're standing. She picked up the medical reference. She set it back down. She said, he's going to use the marriage. I know. He's going to say the omission proves something was wrong from the beginning. That I was hiding because I had something to hide. People can think what they want about why you did what you did, Calder said. I know why you did it, and I'm the only one whose opinion about it matters. She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching. She said, You forgave me. I'm working on it, he said. Don't push your luck. She did almost laugh then. The almost laugh escaped slightly further than usual and became a small real sound, brief and undignified, and Calder's mouth moved at the corner in the way it moved when he was suppressing something he would not call a smile, but was. It was the closest they had come yet to being at ease with each other in the full complicated truth of what they were. Then the storm came. It arrived in the second week of August, with the specific violence that Wyoming summer storms reserved for occasions when the timing was already difficult. It came from the northwest in the afternoon, building fast, and by the time the light had changed, everyone in the valley who had been outdoors was looking at the sky and calculating how long they had. Lenora was in the clinic room when Ada Bell arrived at a full run, which Ada Bell did not do as a general rule, and the fact of Ada running told Lenora everything she needed to know about the severity of what was coming through the door behind her. Wagon overturned at Red Willow Creek, Ada said, breathing hard. Ranch hands from the Henderson spread, at least 5 men, could be more. I don't know the full count. Lenora was already moving. Crew, she said. Cheyenne, won't be back until tomorrow. How far is the creek from here? 20 minutes with a fast horse. 30 with the wagon. Lenora went to the clinic shelf. She pulled the medical bag. She began pulling additional supplies, extra dressings, the morphine vials, the carbolic solution, catgut thread, the full surgical kit, and she was loading them into the secondary case she had built for exactly this kind of call when Calder appeared in the doorway. He looked at her hands and what they were doing and said, I heard. Let's go. The wagon. Already hitching patients. He looked at the cases. What else do you need? Blankets. Every clean cloth in the house. The lanterns, both of them. Hot water in the sealed containers, as much as you can carry. He was gone before she finished the sentence. They reached the creek in 25 minutes. Calder pushing patients harder than he usually did, and Lenora braced beside him on the wagon bench, with both cases secured at her feet, and her mind already running through triage protocols, ranking injuries by severity, before she had seen a single patient. She heard them before she saw them. 2 men shouting. Someone else making a sound that was not quite crying and not quite screaming, but lived in the territory between the two that belongs exclusively to people in serious pain. And underneath that, the particular quality of stunned silence that groups of people produce when something has happened too fast and too badly, and no one has yet recovered enough to know what to do. She was out of the wagon before Calder had fully stopped it. 5 men. 3 on the ground. 2 standing, both clearly injured, but mobile, 1 cradling a wrist, 1 with blood on his face from a scalp wound. The wagon had gone over on the creek bank and come down hard, and 2 of the men on the ground had clearly been underneath it or struck by it, and the 5th was Hank Deller, the Henderson spread foreman, who was conscious and trying to get up and needed to not get up because his right leg was at an angle that meant the femur had broken. "Stay down," Lenora said, and knelt beside him, and he looked at her with the unfocused eyes of a man who is deciding whether to listen to a woman he has never met in the middle of the worst moment of his recent life. "Who are you?" he said. "The doctor," she said. "Don't move that leg. I mean it." He stopped moving. She stood. 5 patients. 2, mobile, 3, down 1 with a compound fracture, and she did not know yet what the other 2 on the ground had sustained. And the light was going to fail in approximately 2 hours, and she was one physician with 2 cases of supplies and a husband who could hand her things and a creek running 6 feet away. She had one moment, one single honest moment, where the gap between what was needed and what she had felt so enormous that her hands went cold and her thinking went quiet in the way it went quiet when fear reached a certain threshold. She breathed. She looked at Hank Deller's leg. She looked at the 2 men on the ground behind him. She made the first decision. "Calder," she said. "Lanterns, now. Then get the blankets on the ground. Men don't move them, just cover them and tell me if either of them is unconscious." "One is," Calder said immediately. He had already crossed to them. "Is he breathing?" A pause. "Yes." "Then he's second. The foreman's leg is first." She moved to the man with the head wound. "You," she said. "What's your name?" "Price," he said. "Price, can you follow instructions?" "Yes, ma'am. I need you to hold pressure on your own head wound while I work on the others. Use this cloth. Press hard and don't let go. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good man." She pressed the folded cloth against the scalp wound, put his own hand over it, and moved. The next 40 minutes were the most technically demanding of Lenora's professional life. She made a wrong call. 12 minutes in, assessed the unconscious man as a head injury first, and had already begun working from that assumption when something about his breathing pattern made her stop, reassess, open his coat, and find the rib fracture and the lung involvement she had initially missed. She corrected it. She moved fast. But she had missed it the first time, and she knew it, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a coal while she worked. She did not stop. She moved between patients in the priority order she had established and revised as new information arrived. And Calder moved with her, not directing, not second-guessing, not performing heroics, simply doing exactly what she asked, at the speed she needed it done, which was fast, and without requiring her to explain why, which was essential because she did not have time to explain why. "Clean water," she said, and had it. "Hold this," she said, and it was held. "I need more light on that side," she said, and the lantern moved. At one point she was halfway through stabilizing Hank Deller's fracture, a procedure that required both hands and both eyes, and most of her concentration when she felt her hands begin to shake. Not much. Not enough that it affected her work, not yet. But she felt it, and she knew what it was: exhaustion and adrenaline reaching the place where they intersect and begin to compete, and she knew that if she acknowledged it even internally, it would get worse. Calder saw it. I was holding the lantern 18 inches from her working hands, and he saw the tremor, and he did not say anything about it, and he did not pretend he hadn't seen it. And after a moment, he said quietly, without inflection, "What do you need?" Not "Are you all right?" Not "Can you keep going?" Not anything that required her to perform capability. She was already spending everything to maintain. "What do you need?" She said, "Tell me the time." He checked. 7:15. "We have 40 minutes of usable light." "Then tell me what to do," he said. She told him. He did it. By the time the light was truly gone, the lanterns were doing the work instead, and Lenora had stabilized all 5 patients. Deller's fracture immobilized and properly splinted. The unconscious man, breathing more evenly with the rib, addressed the scalp wound, closed the wrist, assessed, and wrapped 3 separate sets of instructions written in the dark by feel, because she knew her own handwriting well enough to produce it without seeing it. She stood up. Her back screamed at her. Her feet had stopped registering pain sometime around the 40-minute mark and had gone to a numb, distant ache that she knew would return with interest in the morning. Her hands had steadied. Eventually, she was not sure exactly when she had been too busy to track it, but they were trembling again now that the work was done, which was the body's entirely appropriate response to being asked to function at that level for that long. She stood in the dark beside Red Willow Creek with the lantern light behind her and 5 men she had kept alive, and she thought, I made a mistake. I corrected it. They're all breathing. That was the accounting. That was the only accounting that mattered. Lenora, Calder's voice behind her. She turned. I was standing 3 feet away, holding both lanterns, looking at her with the particular expression she had catalogued over the past months. The one that meant he was adding something to his private reckoning, and the sum was changing. She said, I missed the lung initially. I know, he said. I caught it. I know, he said. I need to say it out loud, she said. So it's accurate. I made an error, and I corrected it, and every man here is stable. That's the true version, and I want to make sure we're working from the true version. Calder looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. All right, she said. He handed her a lantern, and she took it, and they stood there in the dark for a moment, without speaking, and the creek moved past them with its ordinary indifferent sound. And somewhere behind them, Price was saying something to Deller about the relative merits of breaking a leg versus breaking your head, and Deller was telling him to go to hell with the affectionate irritation of 2 men who have worked together long enough to know what the other sounds like when he's frightened. The voice came from the far side of the scene. Lenora had not heard anyone arrive. She did not know who had come or when. Sometime in the past hour, she thought she had been too concentrated on the work to track arrivals. It was a man's voice, older, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. What exactly is happening here? She turned. She had never met Silas Crew. She knew him by description. Ada's description, thorough and specific, 50s, heavy through the chest. A way of entering rooms that suggested he had been in charge of most of the rooms he had ever entered. She knew the shape of him before she knew the man. He was standing at the edge of the lantern light with 2 men behind him, looking at the patients on the ground, looking at the supplies, looking at her. His eyes moved from the cases, to her hands, to her face, and she watched him perform the same calculation every person performed when they encountered her for the first time, size, gender, context. And she watched him arrive at an expression that she recognized as the professional variety of dismissal, polished and practiced. Who are you? He said. Dr. Lenora Voss Rourke, she said. These men are stabilized. I'll need them transported carefully. The foreman has a femoral fracture and cannot be moved without proper support under the brake. Crew looked at the splint she had built from materials available at the scene, 2 straight branches from the creek bank, and a methodical pattern of cloth binding. And something moved through his expression that was not quite respect, and not quite its opposite. I was told you were in Cheyenne, she said. I returned early, he said. He walked toward Hank Deller and crouched down and looked at the leg. He did not touch it. He looked at the splint for a long moment. He stood up. He turned and looked at her. He said in the specific tone of a man who is choosing his words for an audience, You're the one practicing without board approval. The 2 men behind Crew were listening. Calder took 1 step forward. Lenora put her hand out, not looking at him, and he stopped. My credentials are under review by the board, she said, at the request of a complaint filed without evidence. The review will confirm what my diploma from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania already states. She held Crew's gaze. These men needed a physician tonight. You were not here. I was. Your methods saved 5 men, she said. You're welcome to examine my work. Crew looked at her for a long, measured moment. He looked at the patients. He looked at the splint on Deller's leg. He looked at Price, who was sitting up with a neatly closed scalp wound and his color returning. He looked at the unconscious man who was breathing steadily now, who had been breathing irregularly 40 minutes ago, who would be breathing in the morning because Lenora had missed it and then caught it and fixed it. Crew said nothing. That was when Merritt Shaw stepped out of the dark. Lenora had not known he was there. She had not seen him arrive. He must have come with the other men who had gathered at the scene in the past hour, drawn by the sound or the lantern light, or the ordinary frontier communication network that moved news faster than a telegraph when the news was bad enough. Merritt Shaw, who had arrived at Rourke Ranch 3 months ago with a fencing wire wound and left with 12 clean sutures and a story he had been telling ever since. He walked into the lantern light and stood beside Lenora. He looked at Crew. Then he held up his left arm, the sleeve pushed back, the healed scar visible even in the uneven light, clean and straight, and exactly the way a properly sutured laceration looks when it has been correctly closed and correctly managed. "Ask my hand," Merritt said. Nobody said anything. Crew looked at the scar. He looked at Merritt. He looked at Lenora. He did not have an answer for what he was looking at, and the men standing around him knew he did not have an answer, and Lenora watched Silas Crew understand in real time that the argument he had been constructing for 3 months had just been stood in front of and addressed by a man with a healed arm who had held it up in the lantern light for everyone present to see. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired, and her back ached, and her hands were trembling again now that the adrenaline was fully gone, and she had 5 patients to see safely transported before she could think about anything else. She turned away from Crew. "Calder," she said. "Let's get them home." Calder was already moving. Behind her, she heard Crew say something to the men with him, something she did not catch and did not try to catch, because whatever he was saying now was the sound of a man repositioning after a loss, and she did not need to hear it to understand what it was. She picked up the medical bag. She walked toward the wagon. Above the creek, the Wyoming stars were doing their extravagant ordinary thing, indifferent to Silas Crew and his arguments, and the Territorial Medical Board, and every door that had ever been closed before she reached it. She put the bag in the wagon. She climbed up beside Calder. He looked at her once with that expression she had been cataloging for 3 months, the one whose sum kept changing. He picked up the reins. They drove back toward the ranch in the dark, and the lantern light swung with the motion of the wagon, and Lenora sat with her hands in her lap, and the empty, trembling quiet that comes after the work is done, and she thought about 5 men breathing, and a scar on Merritt Shaw's arm, and a physician named Crew, who had looked at her work in the lantern light and found nothing to dispute. It was not victory, not yet. But it was something that victory could be built on, and Lenora Voss had spent her entire life building on less. The Territorial Board's letter arrived on a Tuesday. Lenora was in the clinic room when Ada Bell brought it, and Ada set it on the examination table without ceremony, and stood back with her arms crossed, and the expression of a woman who has already decided how she feels about whatever is inside the envelope, but is giving the other person the courtesy of reading it first. Lenora looked at the envelope. She looked at Ada. She picked it up and opened it and read it standing, because sitting down felt like a concession to nervousness she was not willing to make. The board had reviewed her credentials. The degree from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania was confirmed as legitimate. The complaint filed against her, the letter did not name Crew directly, but it did not need to, had been assessed and found to lack evidentiary support. Dr. Lenora Voss Rourke was confirmed as a licensed physician with full legal standing to practice medicine within Wyoming territory. She read it twice. She set it down. Ada said, "Well, confirmed," Lenora said. Ada uncrossed her arms. Something moved through her face that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the vicinity of both. "Good," she said. "Now we make sure every person in this valley knows it by Friday." "Ada, this is not the time for modesty," Ada said. "Crew spent 3 months telling people your credentials were questionable. The board just said they aren't. That information belongs to the public, and I intend to make sure it gets there." Lenora looked at the letter. She thought about the families who hadn't come. The ranch hand who had gone to Crew instead. The women who had stopped meeting her eyes on the road. "All right," she said. Ada had the news through Red Willow by Thursday. She was efficient about it in the way she was efficient about everything, direct, thorough, without drama. She told people personally where she could, and through the boarding house network where she couldn't, and she framed it simply: the territorial board had investigated and found the complaint baseless. Dr. Voss Rourke's credentials were legitimate. The matter was closed. Crew said nothing publicly. That silence was its own kind of statement, and the Valley read it the way a valley reads most things, accurately, and without much charity toward the person being silent. Lenora heard about his silence from 3 separate people in 4 days. Each one told her with the specific satisfaction of someone reporting that a wrong thing has been set right, and each one expected her to share the satisfaction, and she understood that expectation and appreciated it, and also understood that the clearing of one obstacle was not the same as the clearing of the road. Because Crew was still there. I was still in Red Willow. He was still the physician people had known for 20 years, who had delivered their children and treated their fevers and been present at the difficult moments that accumulate in a community over 2 decades. He had not been exposed as fraudulent. He had been challenged and challenged unsuccessfully, and the difference between those 2 things mattered. Some people still chose him. Some people always would. Lenora had made her peace with that, not easily, not completely, but functionally. She was a practical woman. She dealt in what was real rather than what was ideal, and the reality was that a community's trust was built slowly and repaired the same way, and some of it was never going to be available to her, no matter what she did or how long she stayed. She told Calder this one evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger closed and the lamp burning low. He listened. He said, "Does that bother you?" "Yes," she said. "But you're not stopping." "No." "Then what are you doing with it?" She thought about that. "Putting it in the right category," she said. "There's a category for things you can change, and a category for things you cannot, and a category for things that feel like the first, but are actually the second. Crew having friends in this town is the third category. I spent too long trying to operate on it like it was the first." Calder looked at her across the table. "And now?" "Now I work on what I can actually work on," she said. "And I let the other thing be what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you get that clear about it?" "About 3 in the morning last Thursday," she said. "It's usually 3 in the morning." He almost smiled. "Good time for it." "The only time apparently," she said. It was the most naturally they had ever spoken to each other, she realized. Not the careful correspondence of letters. Not the managed politeness of the early weeks. Not the strained civility of the period after the revelation. Just 2 people at a kitchen table at the end of a long day talking about something real. It had crept up on them without announcement the way most real things did. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it because saying it would change it, and she wanted to keep it exactly as it was for a little longer. The changes in Red Willow came gradually, which was exactly how Lenora had told Ada they would come, and exactly how Ada had told Lenora she would need to be patient about. They came in the form of small, unannounced decisions made by ordinary people with ordinary problems who had exhausted their other options, or who had simply heard enough from enough credible sources to decide the risk was acceptable. A family named Pruitt brought their youngest, a boy of 7, with a persistent cough that had not responded to anything they had tried. Lenora examined him and identified an early bronchial condition and gave them a treatment plan that was specific and achievable without resources they didn't have. The boy improved in 2 weeks. His mother came back to tell Lenora, and she did not merely report the improvement. She sat at the kitchen table and cried briefly and without apology. The way a woman cries when she has been frightened for a long time and the fear has finally been given permission to leave. Lenora sat with her and did not try to manage the moment. She had learned over months of practice in this clinic that some moments needed managing and some needed witnessing, and the wisdom was in knowing which was which. A homesteader named Soren came in with a hand infection that had been worsening for 10 days. He was a large man, taciturn, the kind of man who treated medical attention as a concession to weakness, and had therefore waited until the infection was advanced enough that the choice had been made for him. Lenora told him plainly what the infection could become if they didn't act aggressively and immediately, and she said it in the tone of one practical person, informing another of a relevant fact without drama and without reproach. He said, "You sure about that?" Yes, she said. Crew said it would clear on its own. She paused for one controlled second. When did you see Crew? Week ago. She looked at the infection and thought about a week and kept her expression neutral. I need to lance this and irrigate it thoroughly and pack it, and you need to come back every 2 days. If it tracks further up the arm, you come back immediately, and we have a different conversation. Soren looked at his hand. That going to hurt? Considerably, she said. Do you want something for it? No, he said. All right, she said. Then hold still. He held still through the entire procedure, without making a sound, which she respected. In the uncomplicated way she respected any demonstration of genuine fortitude. And when it was done, he looked at the wrapped hand, and then at her, and said, You're not what I expected. What did you expect? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Don't know exactly. Something softer maybe, or something that needed to prove itself more. I don't need to prove anything to you, she said. I need to treat your hand. Those are different things. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. And the way he said it was nothing like the polite, careful way people had been saying it since she arrived. It was the way you say something to a person you have decided to take seriously. He came back every 2 days. The infection cleared. He told 4 people. This was how it worked. This was the only way it ever worked, not through declarations or board letters or the public discomfiture of Silas Crew, but through the accumulated weight of individual outcomes. Each one, a small, ordinary miracle performed at a kitchen table, or a creek bank, or a homesteader's front room. Each one added to the next, until the weight became something that couldn't be dismissed or disputed or campaigned against. Merritt Shaw had become somewhere in the past months one of the most reliable forces in this accumulation. He did not do it systematically. He was not an organized advocate in the way Ada was organized. He simply talked the way men talk in the places where men in Wyoming territory gathered at fence lines and supply stores, and the saloon on Saturday evenings, and wherever 2 or more riders happened to meet on the same stretch of road, and what he talked about with the comfortable authority of a man who has direct experience of a subject was what had happened to his arm. He rolled up his sleeve at the slightest invitation, and sometimes without one. You want to know about the doctor at Rourke Ranch? He would say, Look at this. I told the story straight. The fencing wire, the blood, the kitchen table, the woman who had appeared with a black bag, and a voice he'd never heard from her before, who had talked him through every step, and asked him whether he wanted morphine, and waited for his answer before proceeding. He told it without embellishment, because the unembellished version was already sufficient, and men in his experience trusted the unembellished version more anyway. One evening, Lenora overheard him telling it to 2 ranch hands who had come to the clinic with a minor injury, and she stood in the hallway outside the clinic door and listened to Merritt describe the moment she had turned around with the bag in her hands, and she heard him say, I didn't know what I was looking at right then. Took me a minute to understand she was a doctor. Not because she didn't look like one, because she looked exactly like one, which wasn't what I was expecting. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter. After a while, Calder came in from outside and found her there and looked at her face and said, What happened? Nothing bad, she said. He waited. Merritt was telling them about the bag, she said. About that first day. Calder poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. What'd he say? She told him what Merritt had said. Calder was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. He's right, you know. You did look exactly like one. I was terrified, she said. I know, he said. You looked terrified, and exactly like a doctor at the same time. That's harder than it sounds. She looked at him. He looked at his coffee. They stood in the kitchen with that between them, and the lamp burning, and Henry somewhere behind them doing his Henry things, and Lenora thought, We have become something. I don't know the exact name for it yet, but we have become something real. She did not say it. She filed it. The sign appeared on a Saturday morning in early October. Lenora found it when she came downstairs, found the clinic door open, which was not unusual, and Calder not at the breakfast table, which was slightly unusual, and Henry sitting in the clinic doorway with the focused attention of an animal supervising a project. She came to the doorway. Calder was standing on a short ladder with a wooden sign in his hands, positioning it above the clinic door frame. The sign was modest, not large, not ornate, painted in plain black letters on pale wood, with the careful, unhurried hand of a man who had taken his time with it. Dr. Lenora Voss, Rourke physician. She read it. She read it again. Calder stepped down from the ladder and stood back and looked at it, and then looked at her. And his expression was the particular expression he wore when he had done something he was not going to explain, and was waiting to see what she made of it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the sign for a long time. "Calder," she said. "You don't like the font," he said. "I can redo the—" "I like it," she said. He stopped. She kept looking at the sign. "No one ever built me a door before," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended, more honest than she had planned to be, which was happening more frequently these days. The planned management of her own emotional interior, losing ground to something less organized and more true. Calder was quiet for a moment. "Then use this one," he said, "until the hinges wear out." She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe, the gesture she made when she needed to feel something solid beneath her palm. The gesture that had become, she realized, a kind of private landmark of the moments that mattered. She kept her eyes on the sign. Behind her, Henry made the small, satisfied sound he made when the humans around him arrived at conclusions he had reached considerably earlier. What shifted after the sign was not dramatic. It was not a single moment of acceptance or a public ceremony of recognition or anything that announced itself as transformation. It was quieter than that and more durable for being quiet. People began calling her Dr. Rourke. Not all of them. Not immediately. But enough and with increasing regularity, and the ones who said it first were the ones who had been treated by her Soren and the Pruitt family, and Price with his closed scalp wound, and the dozen others whose names were in her ledger under dates and diagnoses and outcomes. They said it naturally, the way you say a name that has earned its usage, and when they said it in front of people who had not yet decided, those people listened. Calder noticed. He told her one evening that he'd been at the supply store in Red Willow, and 3 separate men had asked him how the doctor was doing. Not his wife, not the woman out at Rourke Ranch, not the big lady, the doctor. He reported this. He reported useful information plainly and without performance. "How did you answer?" she asked. "Told them she was busy," he said. "Which is true." "It is true," she said. "Also told them she could use more surgical supplies, and that if anyone in town wanted to demonstrate their confidence in her practice, that was a concrete way to do it." He paused. "Ada's idea. She told me what to say." Lenora stared at him. "You and Ada are coordinating." "Ada coordinates," he said. "I follow instructions." She thought about this. "When did that start?" "About 2 weeks after you treated Merritt's arm," he said. "She came to the ranch while you were on the call and told me she had a strategy and asked whether I wanted to be useful. I said yes." Lenora sat with that for a moment. "You didn't tell me. You had enough to think about." "Calder. Lenora." He looked at her. "I'm your husband. I'm also a practical man. Ada Bell is the most strategically intelligent person in this valley, and she had decided to back you. The correct response to that is to be useful, not to report every conversation to you so you can manage it." She opened her mouth. She closed it. She said, "That's the most words you've said at once since I arrived." "I've been saving them," he said. She pressed her lips together against the thing that wanted to happen on her face. "Thank you," she said. "Both of you." He nodded and picked up his fork. She picked up hers. They ate supper. The crew situation resolved itself in the way most situations resolve themselves, when one party has the truth and the other has only the arguments against it, slowly and then all at once. It was not a confrontation. There was no public scene, no dramatic reckoning at the center of Red Willow with the community watching. Crew was a proud man and a strategic one, and he understood when a position had become untenable, and he retreated from his public campaign against Lenora with the same efficiency he had prosecuted it quietly, without announcement, allowing it to simply stop. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. He did not close his practice. He continued to treat the patients who chose him, and some patients continued to choose him. And Lenora treated the patients who chose her, and some patients began choosing her who would not have done so 6 months earlier. And the valley accommodated both of them in the imperfect, pragmatic way that frontier communities accommodate what is necessary. But something had changed that couldn't be unchanged. People had watched what happened at Red Willow Creek. Word had traveled the way. Word always traveled out here fast and faithful to the essential facts, if not always to the details. And what people knew was that 5 men had been injured, and crew had been away, and a woman at Rourke Ranch had gone to the creek in the dark and brought them all home breathing. That story did not require embellishment. It did not require advocacy. It simply existed, and it was true. And it became part of what the valley knew about itself, part of the fabric of shared experience that communities accumulate over time and refer back to when they need to remember who they are and what they value. Lenora was in that fabric now. She had not noticed the exact moment it happened. She suspected there was no exact moment, that it was the accumulation of individual moments, each one small, each one necessary, until the weight of them exceeded whatever resistance remained. Ada told her on a Wednesday afternoon in November, sitting in the clinic room with coffee going cold in her hands, that she had heard crew tell someone that the valley was big enough for 2 physicians. Lenora looked at her. "He said that to Tom Garrity at the supply store," Ada said. "Garrity told me. He said crew said it like he'd decided something and wasn't going to revisit it." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "That's the closest he's going to get to a concession," she said. "I know," Ada said. "I'll take it," Lenora said. Ada smiled, the real smile, the one she kept behind the efficient, organized face she showed the world most of the time. "I thought you might." The partnership between Lenora and Calder had been becoming something else for months without either of them acknowledging it directly, which was their shared tendency and the particular shape of how the two of them moved through significant things, sideways, practical, arriving at the destination before they had agreed on where they were going. It was Calder who named it first, though not in the way Lenora would have predicted. He named it in November, on a morning when she had returned from a night call. A difficult delivery 15 miles out that had required most of her skill and all of her stamina, and she came through the door at 5 in the morning and set the medical bag on the kitchen table and sat down in the nearest chair and did not move. Calder was already up, because Calder was always up before the light, and he looked at her from across the kitchen and took in the specific combination of exhaustion and satisfaction that only appeared on her face after the hardest cases. He put coffee on. He brought it to her and sat across from her and said nothing while she drank it, which was the right thing to do, and he always seemed to know when the right thing was silence. After a while she said, "Mother and child are both well." "Good," he said. "It was close for a while," she said. "I had maybe 40 minutes when I wasn't certain about the mother." "But you were certain enough to keep going." "Yes." He looked at his hands on the table. "Lenora." "Yes." He looked up. "I think I'd like you to stay." She looked at him. "I know you're already staying," he said. "That's not what I mean. I mean—" He stopped. He tried again in the way of a man who speaks precisely and is therefore slower when the precise words matter more than usual. "I mean, I'd like you to stay because you want to be here. Not because we made a practical arrangement. Not because this is where your clinic is, or because leaving would be complicated. Because you want to be here. With me." She held the coffee cup. She looked at his face across the kitchen table, the weathered, direct, entirely unperforming face of a man who had built her a door and coordinated with Ada Bell and moved a waste trench and never once asked her to become smaller in any direction. "I do want to be here," she said. "With me," he said. Not a question, a clarification. "With you," she said. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, the early Wyoming light was doing what Wyoming light does in November, coming slow and silver and serious over the land. And Henry was at the door, asking to be let out in the way he asked every morning, with the patient certainty of a dog who knows the door will open. Calder got up and opened it. He came back and sat down. They finished their coffee in the quiet, ordinary, irreplaceable way of two people who have decided they are in the right place. A week later, the supply donations started. They arrived without announcement. Carbolic acid solution from Tom Garrity at the supply store, who left it with Ada Bell with a note that said, "Simply for the doctor." Surgical thread from a rancher's wife who had sewn enough in her life to know what quality thread looked like and wanted the clinic to have the good kind. A proper medicine cabinet built by a carpenter in Red Willow and delivered to Rourke Ranch by two men who carried it in and set it where Lenora indicated and tipped their hats and left without asking to be thanked. Lenora stood in the clinic room and looked at the cabinet. She went to find Calder. He was in the yard. She stood at the porch rail and called his name, and he looked up and she said, "Did you do this?" He looked at the cabinet visible through the clinic window. "Some of it," he said. "Ada did the rest." "The whole valley did it," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood on the porch with her hand on the rail. She said, "I came here expecting to prove that a woman could be a physician." He looked at her. "I think I've been doing something different," she said. "Something larger, without realizing it." "What's that?" he said. She thought about it for a moment, about Ada's list, and Merritt's arm, and the Pruitt boy's cough, and Soren's hand, and 5 men at a creek, and a board letter, confirming what she already knew, and a sign above a door, and a man who had asked her to stay because he wanted her there. "Proving it to myself," she said. Calder looked at her with the expression she had catalogued all those months ago, and was still cataloging the one whose sum kept changing, and was currently at a number she hadn't anticipated when she answered a letter from a Wyoming rancher on a Tuesday evening in a rented room above a cobbler's shop. "Was there any doubt?" he said. She thought about the administrator who didn't look up, the 17-minute interview, the trunk with the bag buried under petticoats, the porch conversation in the cold, the trembling hands at the creek, the wrong assessment, and the correction, and the 5 men breathing. "Yes," she said. There was doubt. And now? She looked at the sign above the clinic door. Dr. Lenora Voss, Rourke physician. "Not about the important things," she said. Calder picked up what he'd been working on. I went back to work. She went back inside to her clinic, to the medicine cabinet full of things people had decided she deserved to have, to the examination table where ordinary people came when they were frightened and in pain and needed someone to take them seriously. She opened the medical bag. She began organizing the instruments. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. It had only taken her a continent and a cattle rancher and a Wyoming valley and several months of building something out of whatever was available to figure that out. The brass clasps caught the morning light. She closed them. She opened the ledger. She began the day. 3 years after Lenora Voss arrived at Red Willow Station with a buried black bag and a secret she couldn't yet afford to tell a rancher, from the northern edge of the valley, rode to Rourke Ranch in the middle of a February night and knocked on the clinic door hard enough to wake the house. Calder was up first, the way he was always up first, when sound came in the night, and by the time Lenora had her coat on and the lamp lit, he was already at the door, talking to the man in the low, rapid way of two people exchanging urgent information. She came to the door with the medical bag in her hand. The rancher's name was Gus Teller. She had treated his wife twice, his youngest son once, and Gus himself had sat in her clinic chair 6 months ago with a chest infection. He had ignored for 2 weeks, and she had told him plainly that another week of ignoring it would have made the conversation considerably shorter. He looked at her now with the expression of a man who has been riding hard and is not done riding. "It's my neighbor's boy," he said. 14 years old. Took a fall from the barn loft 3 hours ago. His mother sent for crew, but crew's not answering, and I don't know if the boy has 3 more hours. Lenora was already pulling on her boots. "What's his presentation?" "Can't feel his legs," Gus said. The kitchen went very quiet. Calder looked at her. She looked at Gus. "How far?" 40 minutes hard ride. Hour with the wagon. Wagon, she said, because a spinal injury and a hard ride were a combination she would not risk. Calder. "Already going," he said, and he was. She gathered what she needed with the focused speed of someone who had done this enough times that the hands knew the sequence before the mind finished issuing the instructions. Extra dressings. The morphine. The reference she still carried in the bag. Its margins more annotated now than when she'd left Baltimore, 3 years of Wyoming practice, written into the borders in her small, precise hand. She was in the wagon in 4 minutes. The ride was an hour in February, dark with Calder pushing patience at a pace that was the careful maximum, fast enough to matter, not so fast as to risk the wagon on frozen ground. Lenora sat beside him and went through everything she knew about spinal injuries and everything she might be walking into and everything she could and could not do for a 14-year-old boy who couldn't feel his legs. She had learned over 3 years that the preparation was not primarily about information. She already had the information. The preparation was about arriving at the door calm enough to be useful, because a physician who walked in frightened was a physician who communicated fear to the people who could not afford to feel it. She breathed. She was calm by the time they arrived. The boy's name was Samuel. He was lying on the floor of the front room on a flatboard. His father had had the presence of mind to slide under him before moving him, which told Lenora something important about the father, and she said so directly and without preamble, because praise given quickly and specifically to people who have done the right thing under pressure costs nothing and matters considerably. "You did exactly right," she told the father. "Keeping him flat and not moving the spine may be the most important thing anyone did tonight." The father, a man named Cole, with hands that were shaking in the fine, almost invisible way of someone managing terror through action, looked at her and nodded once and stepped back. She went to Samuel. He was conscious. That was the first thing. He was frightened and in pain in his upper body, and she could see in his face the particular bewildered quality of a person who has tried to move something that is not responding, which was the worst kind of fear, because it was fear without a reference point. Nothing in your previous experience tells you how to process the absence of your own body's response. "Samuel," she said, and sat beside him on the floor, because she had learned that speaking to a horizontal patient while standing over them was a power arrangement that served the physician rather than the patient, and she was not interested in that. "I'm Dr. Rourke. I'm going to examine you carefully, and I'm going to tell you everything I find as I find it. Do you understand?" He said yes. His voice was steadier than she expected. "Good man," she said. She examined him with the methodical, thorough attention she gave every patient, and she talked through each step the way she had talked Merritt through his sutures on the first day. Not because Samuel needed the explanation to cooperate, but because knowledge is less frightening than mystery, and she had built her entire practice on that principle. She found what she found. She sat back. She looked at Samuel's face, and then at his parents standing behind her, and she made the decision she always made, which was to tell the truth clearly and without performance, because the truth told plainly was the only thing she had ever found that gave people a solid foundation to stand on when everything else had gone uncertain. "The injury is to your spine," she told Samuel first, because he was the patient, and the patient deserved to hear it before the room. "I cannot tell you tonight exactly what it means for the long term. That requires examination and time and more information than I have right now. What I can tell you is that you are stable, you are not in immediate danger, and everything that can be done for you tonight will be done." She looked at his parents. "He needs to get to Cheyenne," she said. "There are physicians there with experience in spinal injuries. The transport needs to be done carefully. I'll give you detailed instructions, and I'll write a full account of his presentation and my examination for whoever receives him. The board is flat, and it stays under him the entire journey." Cole said, "Will he walk again?" It was the question. It was always the question. She had been asked it or versions of it dozens of times in 3 years, and she had never found an answer that was both honest and comfortable, because honest and comfortable were not always available in the same sentence. "I don't know," she said. "That's the true answer. What I know is that his chances of any recovery are significantly better if he gets proper care within the next day or two. Which means leaving at first light." Cole's wife had been silent through all of this. She was a small woman younger than Lenora had expected, with a face that was doing the specific work of holding itself together in the presence of her child. She said, "Will you write it all down for the Cheyenne doctors?" "I'm doing it now," Lenora said, and opened the bag and took out the journal she carried for exactly this purpose, and began writing. She wrote everything. She wrote it in the clinical, precise language of a physician, writing for other physicians, and she wrote it in full because whoever received Samuel deserved the complete picture, and because Garrett Finch had gone to Cheyenne 3 years ago with a note from her, and she had made herself a promise that no patient she transferred would ever travel without the most complete documentation she could provide. She handed the pages to Cole. She gave him the transport instructions verbally and then wrote those down too. She stayed until Samuel was as comfortable as she could make him. She left at 3 in the morning, in the wagon on the way home, in the February. Dark with the cold settled in properly, and Calder quiet beside her. She let herself feel what she hadn't let herself feel at Samuel's bedside, the specific weight of not knowing which was the part of medicine that no training adequately prepared you for. You learned the knowledge, you practiced the technique. Nobody taught you how to sit with the cases where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and your job was to have done everything correctly, and then release the result to factors outside your control. Calder said, "You did everything you could." "I know," she said. "That's not making it easier." "No," she said. He put his hand over hers on the wagon bench. He left it there. She turned her hand over and held his. They rode back to Rourke Ranch in the February. Dark holding hands in the uncomplicated, solid, entirely unperformed way of two people who have been through enough together that touch does not require occasion. Samuel Teller went to Cheyenne. The news came back in stages over the following weeks. First, that he had arrived and been received. Then, that the spinal damage was incomplete, which was the most important word, incomplete, which meant that the signals were interrupted rather than fully severed, which meant that recovery was possible rather than theoretical. Then, that he was beginning slowly to regain sensation. Then, that he had taken 3 steps with assistance. Then Gus Teller arrived at Rourke Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on the clinic door, and when Lenora opened it, he took off his hat and held it in front of him and said, "Thought you should know the boy took 12 steps yesterday on his own." Lenora stood in the clinic doorway. She said 12. "Counted them myself," Gus said. "His mother asked me to tell you that she wants you to know she counted too." Lenora gripped the doorframe. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Gus put his hat back on. He said, "There are people in this valley who said things about you that weren't right. I was one of them early on. I didn't come here before because I didn't know how to say it straight." He looked at her. "I'm saying it straight now. What you did for that boy, what you did at the creek that night, what you've been doing at this clinic, it matters. It matters to people who haven't told you, and I reckon some of them never will. But it matters." She held the doorframe. "I know," she said, "but thank you for saying it." He nodded. He left. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Ada Bell came that evening, which was either coincidence or coordination, and Lenora had long since stopped trying to determine which of those words applied to Ada's appearances, because the distinction was usually irrelevant to the outcome. Ada brought preserved peaches, because Ada always brought preserved peaches, and she sat at the kitchen table and listened, while Lenora told her about Gus, and about Samuel's 12 steps, and about standing in the clinic doorway, holding the doorframe. And when Lenora finished, Ada said, "You know what this means." "What?" "It means you're not fighting for your right to be here anymore," Ada said. "You're just here." Lenora looked at her. Ada set down her coffee cup. "There's a difference. You stopped noticing it, which is how you know it's real. If you were still fighting, you'd notice every inch of ground. When you're actually standing on solid ground, you just stand." Lenora thought about that. She thought about the past 3 years, the letters and the platform, and the hesitation she had watched in Calder's face, and the kitchen table, and Merritt's arm, and the board letter, and the sign, and Samuel's 12 steps. "I've been standing for a while," she said. "I didn't notice when I stopped fighting." "That's the point," Ada said. Merritt Shaw had become in 3 years something that Lenora had not anticipated when she sutured his forearm at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon that had changed the direction of everything he had become. Her most vociferous, least solicited, and entirely genuine advocate. And the combination of those 3 qualities made him more effective than any organized campaign could have been. He showed up at the clinic on a Wednesday in March with no injury and no appointment, and sat down in the patient chair and looked at her across the examination table and said, "I want to do something useful." Lenora looked at him. "You've been doing something useful for 3 years." "I've been talking," he said. "I mean something more organized." "What did you have in mind?" "Ada's been thinking about a medical supply run," he said. "Families on the far edges of the valley who can't make it to the clinic. She wants to organize a quarterly supply distribution, medicines, dressings, basic instruction on things people can manage at home. She needs someone to manage the transport and the logistics." "And you volunteered." "I volunteered before she finished the sentence," he said. "But she told me to come ask you first because it's your medicine and your program. And she said I needed to learn to ask before organizing things that belong to other people." Lenora looked at him. "Ada told you that?" "She was quite specific about it," he said. "She usually is," Lenora said. She told him yes. The quarterly supply run became one of the most reliable things Lenora built in those years, Merritt managing the wagon and the logistics with the focused efficiency of a man who has found a purpose that fits the shape of who he actually is. Ada organizing the supply lists and the family contacts. Lenora preparing the medicines and the instruction cards she wrote in plain language specifically designed for people who needed medical information without medical vocabulary. They went out 4 times a year, the 3 of them covering the far reaches of the valley that Crew had never covered, and Lenora alone could not have reached systematically. People were waiting for them. That was the thing that stayed with Lenora, that people were waiting. They had been waiting for years, in some cases, with problems they had managed alone, because management was the only option available. And when the wagon came, they came out of their houses with the particular quality of relief that belongs to people who have stopped expecting help and received it anyway. She treated a woman who had been managing a thyroid condition through sheer determination for 4 years. She found 2 children with the early signs of conditions that were entirely manageable, if caught early, and considerably more serious if not. She instructed a rancher's wife in the treatment of burns, which were the most common household injury in the territory and the most frequently undertreated. She sat with an old man who was dying of something that could not be treated, and who simply wanted a physician to tell him honestly what was happening to his body, because he had the right to know, and no one had told him. She told him. She held his hand while she did it, because that was also part of the work. She drove home from that call in silence, and Merritt and Ada, to their credit, let her be silent the whole way back to Rourke Ranch. Calder was on the porch when they pulled in. He looked at her face. He said nothing. He got up and went inside, and when she came through the door, the coffee was already on, and Henry was at her feet, and the lamp was lit, and the kitchen was warm. And these were ordinary things, daily things, things that had been true for 3 years and would be true tomorrow. And she stood in the kitchen with her coat still on and thought, this is what it looks like. This is the life I was trying to find. It doesn't look like I thought it would. It's better. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook. She sat down at the kitchen table. Calder set the coffee in front of her and sat across from her and said, "Hard one." "Yes," she said. "Want to talk about it?" "Not tonight," she said. "All right," he said. He picked up the account ledger she'd left on the table that morning and looked at it and set it back down and said, "You're going to need another supply order. The carbolic is running low." "I know. I'm writing it this week." Ada mentioned a family on the North Ridge who haven't come in yet. The Brantley family. "She told me. I'm planning to go next Tuesday." He nodded. They talked about the practical things, the supply order, and the Brantley family, and the state of the clinic inventory, and whether the second examination table she had been considering was worth the expense. And the practical conversation was also the other conversation, the one underneath which was, "I see you. I see the work you do and what it costs you. And I am here at this table every evening when you come home, and I will be here tomorrow." She had learned to hear both conversations simultaneously. She had also learned that this was love, not the declared dramatic variety she had read about in novels and found implausible. But this, the person at the table when you get home. The coffee already made. The account ledger noticed. The silence accepted without explanation required. It had taken her a long time to recognize it, because she had been looking for something that announced itself, and this had arrived without announcement, and stayed without drama, and become over 3 years the most reliable thing in her life. She recognized it now. She looked at him across the kitchen table. She said, "Calder." He looked up from the ledger. She said, "I want you to know something." He waited. "When I answered your letter," she said, "I was running away from something. I told myself I was making a practical decision, but I was running. I was frightened, and I was out of options, and I packed a bag full of secrets, and got on a train, and hoped that somewhere in Wyoming there was a life I could fit inside." She paused. "I want you to know that what I found was better than what I was looking for." Calder was quiet for a moment. He set down the ledger. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 3 years, the one that had started as careful assessment and become over time something she could only describe as completely undefendably fond. "I wrote to a matrimonial agency," he said, "because I needed a practical woman who could help me build something. That's what I told myself, and it was true as far as it went." He looked at his hands. "What I didn't tell the agency because I didn't know how to say it yet was that I had been alone for a long time, and that alone had started to feel permanent in a way I didn't like. I wanted someone to build with. Not just the ranch. Something larger." He looked at her. "Seems they sent considerably more than I ordered." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you intend to complain?" "Not once," he said. Henry, from his position at Lenora's feet, made the small, satisfied sound he made when the humans arrived at conclusions he had endorsed considerably earlier. The years that followed were not easy. Frontier life did not become easy because love was present in it. It remained demanding and exhausting, and occasionally heartbreaking, and always requiring more than you thought you had. There were hard winters and difficult cases, and nights when Lenora came home and sat at the kitchen table, and Calder sat with her without speaking, because speaking wasn't what was needed. There were arguments, real ones, about real things, the kind that come between two strong-willed people who care deeply about what they're doing and occasionally disagree about how to do it. There were patients she could not save. There were days when the valley's acceptance felt fragile and provisional, and she had to remind herself that fragile and provisional was not the same as false. But the clinic stayed open. It stayed open through the hard winters and the difficult cases, and the arguments and the losses, and the sign above the door stayed there. The paint weathered and repainted, twice the letters still clear. Dr. Lenora Voss, Rourke physician, and people came through it. They came with broken bones and fevers and infections and difficult births and the ordinary accumulation of physical catastrophe that belongs to hardworking people, living hardworking lives in an unforgiving territory. They came because they had heard from someone who had heard from someone who had heard from Merritt Shaw at a fence line, or Ada Bell at the boarding house, or Gus Teller at the supply store, that the doctor at Rourke Ranch would take them seriously and tell them the truth and do everything she could. They came because results had become her reputation. That was the thing Lenora had told Ada years ago, and had believed intellectually before she understood it in her body, that the only argument against prejudice that permanently holds is a body of work too large and too well documented to be dismissed. Every patient treated, every outcome recorded, every instruction followed up on. Every family told the truth plainly and without condescension. Every night call answered. Every creek bank emergency managed with whatever was available. It accumulated. She had not set out to change Red Willow Valley's understanding of what a woman physician was capable of. She had set out to build a practice, and to be left alone to practice it, and to live inside a life she had chosen rather than one she had been assigned. The changing of minds had been a consequence rather than a goal, and she suspected that was why it had worked, that the people who had changed their minds had done so because of what they had seen and experienced, rather than because of what they had been told to think. And beliefs that arrive through experience are considerably more durable than beliefs that arrive through persuasion. On an evening in late spring, 4 years after the westbound train from Baltimore, Lenora came home from a long call and set the medical bag on the kitchen table. The leather was cracked along the seam where the handle attached. The brass clasps had been polished so many times the plating was gone entirely, and the bare metal shone instead, which she found she preferred more honest about what it was. She sat down. Calder came in from the yard and looked at the bag the way he had looked at it the first time he saw it in her hands, with recognition she realized now. He had known before she told him. He had been adding things up, and the sum was already close to the truth. He had simply waited for her to say it. He sat across from her. He looked at the bag. He said, "I remember carrying that trunk from the station." "I remember watching you carry it," she said. "It was heavy. It had everything in it I thought I needed to hide." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. "Nothing in it needs hiding now." She looked at the bags on the table. The bag that had crossed America in the bottom of a trunk under 2 petticoats and her father's Bible. The bag that had been opened on a kitchen table for Merritt Shaw and carried to a creek bank in the dark, and brought to a boy who had fallen from a barn loft and driven to the far edges of a valley 4 times a year for 3 years. The bag that now sat openly on a kitchen table in Wyoming under a sign bearing her name. "No," she said. "Nothing." He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his the way she had held it in the February dark, driving home from Samuel Teller's house, and the way she had held it on 100 other evenings when the work had been hard, and the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was on, and the person across the table was the person who had built her a door and told her to use it until the hinges wore out. Outside somewhere in Red Willow Valley, there were people whose bones had healed clean, and whose infections had cleared, and whose children were breathing easily, and whose difficult births had ended with mothers and babies both present and alive. There were people who carried Lenora's instructions in their memory and her written cards in their kitchen drawers, and who had told their neighbors when their neighbors were sick and frightened that there was a doctor at Rourke Ranch who would take them seriously. There was a boy named Samuel who was walking. There was a man named Merritt whose arm had a scar that he showed to anyone who needed to see it. There was a woman named Ada who had decided on the day she first walked into Lenora's kitchen to be on the right side of something, and had been on that side every day since, with the organized, relentless, peach-preserving efficiency that was entirely her own. There was a dog named Henry who had made his assessment in 45 seconds and never revised it. And there was a woman who had buried the most important part of herself under petticoats in a trunk and carried it across a continent because she believed with the specific exhausted desperation of someone who has been told no too many times that she had to hide what she was in order to be given a chance to become it. She had been wrong about that. She had learned it slowly and then completely, the way you learn the most important things through evidence accumulated over time, through the weight of experience, pressing against the shape of a prior belief, until the belief gives way to something truer. A person's worth does not begin when the world agrees to recognize it. It does not begin when the board confirms the credentials, or the valley changes its mind, or the difficult man says, "The valley is big enough for 2. It begins where it has always been, in the work, in the showing up in the hands that know what to do and do it in the voice that tells the truth. When the truth is hard in the person who crosses a continent with everything hidden and builds a life anyway. One patient at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one door at a time." Lenora Voss had come west expecting to prove something to the world. What she had proven in the end was something far more important. She had proven it to herself, and Calder Rourke, the lonely rancher, who had asked a matrimonial agency for a practical woman and received instead a physician, a partner, and the most consequential thing that had ever happened to Red Willow Valley, looked across the kitchen table at his wife and understood with the complete and undefended certainty of a man who had stopped keeping a private accounting because the sum had long since exceeded anything he knew how to measure, that he had gotten considerably more than he ordered. He had asked for someone to build a home beside him. He had gotten a woman who built a healthier world around it. And not once, not for a single day in all the years that followed, did he find anything in that to complain about.